Our reading today is a passage from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It opens with Scrooge's former business partner, Jacob Marley, speaking. Oh, captive, bound, and double ironed, cried the phantom, not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness, not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one's life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I, oh, such was I. But you were always a good man of business, Jacob, faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. Business, cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business.
Dickens and A Christmas Carol. We all know that story, whether or not we've ever read it. It's part of our culture. One of the Christmas stories that gets aired around this time every year. It's been made into live action movies with likely and well-cast actors like Alastair Sim and Patrick Stewart, and less likely actors like Bill Murray and George C. Scott and even Jim Carrey. It's been animated numerous times. The Muppets have done a version. So has Mickey Mouse. So has Mr. Magoo, for heaven's sake. And the basic plot of the story has been used in any number of television shows. The bad person being visited by the ghost of his past, his present, and his future, and his changing his character as a result. We all know this story, these characters, this plot. Or do we? Maybe if we look at A Christmas Carol with new eyes, we might see something very different. A story that's not really about Christmas. A story that's more Unitarian Universalist than Christian. A story that relates, more than we might like, to our own lives. Let's start with why it's not a Christmas story. Christmas just happens to be the temporal setting of the story, as London and its environs are the physical setting. But if you think about what really happens over the course of the story, it's the tale of a person who re-examines his life, who looks back at who he was and who he is now, and what he's likely to turn into if he doesn't change. And because of that examination, he does change. He resolves to be a different person, to live a different life. That's not a Christmas thing. That's a New Year's thing, isn't it? And if you really look at A Christmas Carol, it's much more a New Year's story than a Christmas one. Oh, sure, there are references of people going to church, and there are lots of scenes of special meals and social events, which are connected to Christmas. And here and there, Dickens even makes an explicit reference to the birth of Jesus. But that's not what motivates Scrooge. He's not changed by the fact of its being Christmas. He's not changed by some realization about the birth of Jesus or God's grace or anything having to do with the classic Christmas story, which isn't even really touched on here. Scrooge is changed by the fact of what he's realized about himself and about the world around him. Here we are at the end of this dreadful year, looking back, looking forward. So is Scrooge through the medium of the ghosts. Maybe our review of our lives isn't as dramatic as Scrooge's, but aren't we also making resolutions to change in large or small ways? While we know from the end of the book that Scrooge actually kept his resolutions, unlike me, unlike a lot of us, the fact that he's making resolutions to change his life is something we all do. Scrooge starts out the book in his own little bubble of isolation. He comes across as actively unlovable, a man who seems to go out of his way to repel anyone around him, to have no connections other than financial and business related with other human beings. He treats his clerk, Bob Cratchit, as if he were a machine that could and should get by with the absolute minimum of input. He rejects his only relative, his nephew Fred, when the nephew comes to invite him to Christmas dinner. He not only rejects, but actively insults the two men from the charity who come, misguidedly, to see if he could possibly contribute to making life better for the poor and destitute. He even goes so far as to scare off the one kid who starts singing a Christmas carol at his door. This is a man, you would think, who has no love in his life at all. But that's not true. It's not only that he had love in his past, as we shall see, but there are even people who love him now, as misanthropic and even nasty as he is. That nephew, Fred, comes every year to try to get Scrooge to join the family, even though Fred knows perfectly well that Scrooge is going to turn him down every year. Why would anyone do that but for love? Fred loves his uncle, even though Scrooge doesn't acknowledge it and doesn't even seem to be worthy of it to our eyes. And someone else loves him too, someone even more surprising, his deceased partner, Jacob Marley. The most surprising thing about Jacob Marley's intervention on Scrooge's behalf isn't that he's a ghost, although that is what we tend to remember about him, but that this is so different from what Marley was like when he was alive. We know this because Dickens tells us that Scrooge and Marley were entirely alike in their attitude toward charity. Marley was not, as far as we can tell, a loving man when he was alive. And yet, here he is, not only coming to see Scrooge, but arranging for Scrooge to receive the three spirits who will change Scrooge's life, which nobody did for Marley himself. Marley makes it clear that he had to do a great deal of work to make this happen. Why would anyone do that but for love? Scrooge doesn't recognize that he is loved, not at the beginning. You might say that his journey over that long night is a journey to discover that he is lovable, that he is loved, and that he can love other people. Certainly by the end of the book, in that wonderful series of scenes in which Scrooge shows what a changed man he is, it's clear that he can be loving, that he has found, again, that capacity to be loving toward others. What I think is more important, though, is that Scrooge always had that capacity. He deliberately shut himself off from it, but it was always a part of him. He was never irredeemable. And can we hear a strong hint of universalism in that? A lot of people think Scrooge changes because he's afraid of death. That's why the last scene with the ghost is when Scrooge sees his own name on the tombstone. But that's not what's really going on in that scene. It's not that he realizes that he's going to die and be buried. He's an old man. He's seen a lot of people die. He's seen his partner die. He saw his sister die. He's not surprised that he's going to die. And in fact, no matter whether he changes his life or not, he's still going to die. He's still going to be that name on that tombstone. No, the revelation that breaks him at the graveyard is that the dead man he's been shown over and over, directly and indirectly, is him. That man we saw had no friends or even acquaintances to go to his funeral unless a lunch was provided. That man was so alone at the time of his death that the undertaker, the housekeeper, and the charwoman stole everything from his corpse, and there was no one there to stop them. That man was such a horrible person that the only emotion the ghost could show Scrooge about the man's death was relief on the part of his debtors, who were finally going to get some mercy that man would never have given them. The point was not that Scrooge died. The point was that Scrooge had lived in such a miserable, unloved, and unloving manner. But that, I would argue, is just the icing on the cake. Scrooge had already been changed before the visit of the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. In fact, I believe the moment that Scrooge takes a step toward becoming a better person is much, much earlier, a moment you don't usually see in the movie versions. When Scrooge is with the Ghost of Christmas Past, he sees himself as a boy, a miserable child left alone over the holidays at a dreadful boarding school. He weeps with the memory, the first time we've seen him cry in the whole book. And then there's this exchange. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, putting his hand in his pocket, looking about him after drying his eyes with his cuff. "But it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge, "nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all." This is the first time Scrooge has made a connection between his present life and his past. More, this is the first time Scrooge has had a sympathetic thought for someone other than himself. To me, this is the turning point. Everything that comes after that builds on Scrooge's newfound ability to make that connection, to show sympathy for someone else. What the Ghost of Christmas Past gives Scrooge is a reminder of who he was, More, it's a reminder of what he still is. After we've met Scrooge and all his misanthropic misery in the first stave, we, and Scrooge, see that there was a time in his life when he was lovable, when he was loved, when he had connections to the wider world, to other people, to his sister, Fan, to his co-worker, to his employer, to Belle, his fiancée. It is a reminder to Scrooge that what he is now is not what he had always been and not what he has to be, that he has in many ways chosen to be this isolated, miserable person. But that other Scrooge is still there somewhere in him. The person who was beloved by his little sister, the person who was close friends with his fellow apprentice and treated like a member of the family by Fezziwig, his employer, the person who won the love of someone as good and kind as Belle. That was Scrooge. It's significant that when he's with the ghost of Christmas past, Scrooge makes the connection to his present life himself. The ghost doesn't do it. The ghost hints about how good an employer Fezziwig was, but it's Scrooge who says, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all. This is the one spirit he begs to leave. He tells the ghost, I cannot bear it. But what he cannot bear isn't the ghost torturing him, but the realization of how far he is from what he used to be and how much that distance has cost him. If the ghost of Christmas past opens Scrooge's eyes to who and what he is, it's the ghost of Christmas present who opens Scrooge's eyes to the world around him. And that's something Scrooge desperately needs. When the men from the charity come to his office on Christmas Eve, and he makes some of his most infamous and heartless remarks, are there no prisons? If they would rather die, they had better do so and decrease the surplus population. He makes it clear why he doesn't want anything to do with helping other people. The men tell him about the dire conditions in which so many poor people live, and Scrooge says, besides, excuse me, I don't know that. But you might know that, observed the gentleman, and Scrooge responds, it's not his business, and he doesn't pay attention to anything but his own business, which keeps him occupied all the time. The ghost of Jacob Marley, as we heard in the reading, has learned after his death that there's more to his business than what happened behind the doors of Scrooge and Marley. And the ghost of Christmas present demonstrates this to Scrooge himself. Here is a man who knew only that Bob Cratchit had a wife and children. He didn't care to know anything more than that about the man who worked for him for years and years. He could have found out that Cratchit had a number of children whom he struggled to support, and that one of those children was crippled and very ill. Scrooge didn't want to know, didn't bother to find out. To him, Cratchit was no more than a piece of equipment that he used in his business. Here's a man who went out of his way to alienate his only living relative, his nephew, Fred, who always made an effort to see Scrooge as lovable, to bring him into his family and into the wider world. Here's a man who, living in London in the 19th century, where the extremes of wealth were painful and obvious, made no effort to find out anything about his fellow human beings in his own city. Here's a man who needed to learn how to see. The ghost of Christmas present doesn't just take him to see Bob Cratchit and to see Fred. He takes Scrooge all over, into poor people's houses, into prisons, into hospitals, into the high and the low, from the mining country to the wilds of the ocean. He takes Scrooge to places Scrooge never dreamed existed. He forces Scrooge to see the truth of the world around him and, without saying so in so many words, forces Scrooge to realize that he is a part of this interdependent web of existence. The ghost of Christmas present is the one who uses Scrooge's words against him more than once. When Scrooge sees Tiny Tim and realizes that the child is going to die within a year unless things change, the ghost quotes Scrooge. If he'd be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. And of course, it's the ghost of Christmas present who shows Scrooge ignorance and want, as he saw in the clip from the Patrick Stewart version of the story. Ignorance and want, mankind's children, mankind's scourge. Ignorance in particular is doomed to humanity, according to the ghost. And haven't we seen this, especially this year? Haven't we had direct experience of the terrible dangers of ignorance, made worse by those who use it for their own factitious purposes, to quote the ghost? As long as our only response to need and ignorance is to punish, the ghost says, and Scrooge realizes, we're doomed. The book is a story of redemption, a story of a person putting aside deliberate blindness and learning to see. The story of a person who isolated himself from humanity and discovers, almost too late, his connections to others and his obligation to build and maintain those connections. At the end of the book, when Scrooge wakes and realizes he's not dead and he still has time to change his life, he makes immediate changes. It's significant, I believe, that when he encounters the man from the charity again, he offers him a sum so large the man can hardly believe it. And Scrooge says, a great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. It's not enough to just say, I'll be better from now on. Scrooge realizes he has to make amends, make up for the things that he hasn't been doing that he should have. He sees Bob Cratchit at last as a human being. He not only gives him a raise, which he undoubtedly should have done long before, but he assists Cratchit's family, becoming a second father to Tiny Tim and the others. He takes up his nephew's invitation to join Christmas dinner and rejoins his family, which couldn't have been easy on his pride given what he'd said to his nephew the previous day and undoubtedly many times before. It's also important to notice what doesn't happen in the book. Scrooge's change is not through fear of hell. Indeed, other than the vision of the ghost which Jacob Marley shows Scrooge, there's very little sense of an afterlife at all. Scrooge does not throw himself on the mercy of God or get a revelation about the true meaning of Christmas in the religious sense at all. Scrooge's change is a deeply humanistic one, a man realizing his own humanity and the humanity of the people around him, who are, as Fred says early in the book, fellow passengers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Though Dickens doesn't make it explicit, Scrooge comes to realize the inherent worth and dignity of all people. He comes to glimpse the interdependent web of existence. Even someone like Scrooge, who starts the book out as the least prepossessing of people, someone so mired in his own world that it seems he can't possibly become better, even someone like that is capable of redemption. Not without work, not without some serious reflection and thought, but yes, even Scrooge can change, can become a better person to those around him. And while we're thinking of Scrooge and his journey, I have to say that this year, when I reread the book for the umpteenth time, because that's a Christmas tradition of mine, for the first time, I felt an uncomfortable connection to Scrooge. True, I love Christmas, and I'm a social creature who's never happier than when I'm around other people, so I'm not like Scrooge in those regards. But that line of his and the response of the charitable gentleman made me think, how much is going on around me that I choose not to know about because I'm so busy with my own business, even though my own work and family business is, as Jacob Marley would say, a drop in the ocean of my real business. As a gentleman says, I might know about it if I chose to, if I looked around me, if I opened my eyes. Scrooge is an extreme case, that's for sure, but can we really say we don't have some of that attitude ourselves? Perhaps we, like Scrooge, should go on our own New Year's journey of self-discovery and discovery of the world around us, to open our eyes to who we are, who we want to be, how we're connected to each other and the rest of the world before it's too late. With that attitude in mind, may we live out our own New Year's carol and be the better for it. Amen. Blessed be.